Chapter 8. Thanksgiving. 1 month later, 1st of November. Laila woke up next to Steve, and she smiles before kissing his cheek, and she gets up and changes into comfortable daywear. And she walks over to the kitchen, and she starts to cook some breakfast for both her and Steve. As she is cooking, Laila decides to put on some music. The music studio that came on through the radio was 90s music, and one song caught her attention, and she hums along to it as she finishes the breakfast. Laila hears footsteps coming out of the bedroom, and she looks over to Steve as he walks over and she checks him out, as late in the night he took off his shirt as he was hot. "Morning," Laila says as she places Steve's plate on the table after putting eggs, toast, sausages and bacon on the plate. "Morning, doll." Steve smiles and he goes to sit down, and he watches Laila plate up her food before starting to eat. Laila sat down next to Steve and she starts to eat her food. I might have overdone myself," Laila mumbles as she takes a bite out of her buttery toast, and Steve does a little chuckle as he is eating his sausages. "I'd give it a 5-star rating on Yelp," Steve says, and Laila looks at him with a little smirk on her lip. "Oh, so we are on Yelp now?" "Great to know," Laila teases as she nudges his knee under the table. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The golden lights from the sun spilled in through the kitchen window, casting a gentle glow across the counters and plate. Laila looks over to Steve as she brushes off a crumb off her mouth with her thumb. "So, what shall we do today?" Laila asks, and Steve looks out of the window for a moment. He looks thoughtful, like he is trying to decide between something spontaneous or something familiar. Then with an exhale, he shook his head and smiles. "Honestly, I do not know. Nice not having a plan," Steve says as he raises his cup of coffee to his lips and takes a sip before lowering it to say, "No world to save, no Hydra to punch. It's just us." Laila gave a small content sigh and rested her chin to her hand, watching him with affection as she says with a tease in her tone, "You're getting soft, Captain." Steve raised his eyebrow, lip twitching before he says, "Don't make me challenge you to a push-up contest again." Laila laughs as she sets down her mug, and she looks at him. "Please, you only won last time because you distracted me with shirtless charm," Laila says, which made Steve smirk behind his cup before putting it down as he finishes with his coffee. "Worked, didn't it?" Steve says, and Laila rolls her eyes before standing up and walks over to him and wraps her arms around him as she rests her chin on top of his head. "How about we go for a drive?" Laila suggested and added, "No destination, just the open road, some music, hot drinks, and whatever fall colours are left." Steve smiles as he reaches up and grabs her hand, presses a kiss on her knuckles as he says, "Sounds perfect." And Laila smiles before getting a message from Tony that she reads out to Steve. "Attention, Captain Goody Two Boots and Asgardian Fury Barbie. You are formally, and by that I mean begrudgingly, invited to the annual Starksgiving dinner at Avenger's Tower this Thursday. Festivities start at 4 p.m. sharp, but knowing you two, you will show up at 3:45, just to prove how punctual and perfect your relationship is. There will be food, there will be pie, there will be me in an apron yelling at Vision for trying to microwave the turkey again. Dress code, casual but hot. Steve, that means wear anything other than your war uniform. Laila, feel free to glam it up and make the rest of us feel underdressed. Again. Oh, and if you two show up holding hands and glowing like the Hallmark Channel, I will gag. Love you both. Mean it. RSVP or I am sending Bruce to retrieve you personally. Steve shakes his head as he sighs and holds his head. He sinks back into his chair, fingers rubbing his temple like the message Laila read out gave him a headache. Looks like we got invited to Thanksgiving. Haven't did that in a while, Laila says as she looks at Steve, and she leans down and kisses his cheek as she continues. Hey, we don't have to be there now. We can still go for that drive. Steve looks over to her before pulling her onto his lap with her squealing and giggling. Good, because right now I'd rather spend time with you than Tony right now, Steve says with a smile. Laila does a little smile before leaning forward and kissing him, then pulls back with a slight tease in her tone again. Are we going to go for that drive? Or we are just going to stay here? Steve chuckles before helping Laila off his lap, then stands up and looks at her. Well, we better get changed and leave, Steve says, and Laila nods before both walked into the bedroom. While changing, Laila quickly took a sneak peek at Steve as he is getting ready, but Steve catches a glimpse of Laila checking him out, and he teases her by flexing his muscles slightly, which Laila grabs a pillow and throws it at him. Teaser, Laila says, and she finishes getting dresses alongside Steve, and they walked out of the bedroom. Both Steve and Laila walks to the car that Steve has bought with help from Clint, and they start to go for the drive, talking, laughing, and listening to music. After a few weeks, the days grows colder, the trees shedding their last golden as the city settled for November. Steve stood by the window of Laila's apartment, watching the streets below with a faint smile. Behind him, the scent of cinnamon and coffee clung to the air. Laila's doing, of course. Laila emerges from the bedroom as she slips on her jacket, but she raises her hand to stop Steve from talking as she walks over to the kitchen and makes herself a cup of coffee. Are you sure you're ready to go? Last time Tony had a celebration at his shit went nuts, Laila says as she looks over to Steve as she takes a sip of her coffee. Well, it is Scarlett's doing. She loves to be too impulsive, Steve says, and Laila makes a oh as she puts down her mug. Are we sure that Scarlett is Tony's sister? Laila teases, and she quickly finishes her drink, and she walks over to Steve, and she wraps her arms around him. Steve chuckles as he said that as he wraps his arms around her waist. Both Laila and Steve stayed like that for a moment, just looking into each other's eyes before Laila's phone went off, breaking the moment. Way to ruin the moment, phone, Laila says as she removes her arms, and she grabs her phone and reads the message from Natasha. What is it? Steve asks as he watches Laila, and Laila looks at him. We better get going, or Tony will throw a hissy fit. Laila tells Steve. Then, they both start to walk over Steve's car, and they get inside, and Steve starts to drive to the Avengers Tower. After arriving, Laila and Steve are talking in the elevator, and they hear a ding to signal that they have arrived at their location, and they walked out to noises like chatting, laughing, and more. Finally! Was going to call the police officers to find your asses, Tony says as he sees Steve and Laila walk in. Hilarious, Tony! Laila walks in and she sees all the Avengers gathered around, and she walks over and sits down next to Natasha and Pepper. After a while, Scarlett calls out as she calls for everyone to sit at the dinner table as dinner is ready. Dinner is ready! Everyone get your asses to the table before I unleash Thor with a gravy boat, Scarlett calls out. Everyone gets from their respected places and walks over to the kitchen and sits in their respective seats. Knowing Tony, he would try and make Laila and Steve close to each other, like a teacher seating the couples together in class. All right, lovebirds, make sure there is snuggling on the table. Some of us wants to eat, Tony says as he sits down at his respective seat next to Pepper. Tony, you do realise Laila could say the same thing to us? Pepper said. Anyways, let us begin eating, shall we? Before Clint steals all the rolls, Scarlett says as she watches Clint steal about 3 rolls. But before anyone could dig in, however, Tony stood up with his glass of wine. Before we beginning, I would like to make a toast, Tony says, and Clint groans. Oh boy, here we go, Clint mumbles to himself as Tony starts to give a speech. Look around the table. We have a super soldier, one amazing of an assassin, a guy who shoots arrows like it's 1995, a literal god, a witch who can crush our brains with her pinky, a speedster also known as our personal espresso shot, in human form, another chaos monster in form, as my lovely young sister who just happens to be dating Boy Scout who isn't here, as he's busy helping Justice League or whatever, a sass monster who put Thor in a timeout once because he walked into her private room with 2 altars. And last but not least, your wonderful, brilliant host. Me, Tony says. Tony raised his glass up, and the table erupts into mismatched cheers, groans, and one rouge fireball from Pietro lighting a candle. To found family, to chaos, and to pretending we're normal for one whole dinner. Tony finishes off. Everyone yells, "Cheers!" before Thor accidentally made a pyre flew, but Laila manages to capture it as everyone laughs. However, Scarlet whispers to Laila before throwing a fluffy scoop of sweet potato mash at Pietro. "What's the Scarlet?" Pietro yells. "Whoops, must have slipped," Scarlet says innocently as she shrugs her shoulders. "Oh, it's on Stark, Princess," Pietro says before running around in a blur. Suddenly, Natasha's drink has changed to a can of whipped cream. Clint's face is covered in cranberry sauce, and Tony's glasses disappears. "A feast battle! Glorious!" Thor yells as he laughs, and he picks up one turkey leg and throws it like it's Mjolnir, and it misses Tony by an inch as it hits a lighting fixture. "This is why we can't have nice things," Tony yells, and Scarlet laughs. "Scarlet, did you have to start this? We could have had a nice Thanksgiving dinner for once," Laila says. "It was strategic chaos," Scarlet says, and Laila sighs as she holds her head. "Come near me, Speedster. I'll find something that weaken your powers." Laila threatens Pietro as he tries to hit her with some food. "Scarlet started this!" Steve yells as he tries to de-escalate the food fight. "At least I waited until after the toast," Scarlet yells as she hits Tony in the face with some pie. After a while, everyone is covered in food. The dining area is a war zone of gravy puddles, fallen cutlery, and defeated desserts. Steve has whipped cream in his hair thanks to Natasha. "Next time, we're catering and you all are eating outside," Tony says in a serious tone. "Worth it," Scarlet laughs.